Well, it's quite interesting because we were talking about Joe Biden earlier and who he's surrounded by. And although I hate everything he says about Ukraine, oddly, he seems to be holding the line about more escalation, doesn't he, in your view? I know he's writing checks and they're sending weapons and stuff, but he seems to be kind of moderate on more engagement. Am I right about that?
I don't know. I thought so at first until he gave this speech in Warsaw where he talked about effectively removing Putin from power.
Right.
And seemed overwrought by the great danger presented by, the Russians and we're going to defend every inch of territory that's NATO and so forth and so on. That was unhinged in my judgment. And I've never been comfortable with this business of removing other people's governments, especially removing individual leaders. This kind of thing is a disaster. I mean, it goes all the way back to the Second World War and unconditional surrender, which Churchill mentioned when it was announced. He was shocked. It had never been discussed with him. And he immediately concluded this is a disaster. This is going to cause the war to last for years longer than it otherwise would. I'm very uncomfortable with that sort of business. And it seems to be par for the course with this administration. But again, when I say this administration, that's misleading, Trish, because you can point to all sorts of people in the so-called opposition party, if there is one, that are just really as, excited and enthusiastic about dragging us into a direct confrontation with Russia as anybody else in the Biden administration.
Well, it also seems now, and you wrote about this in one of your more recent blogs, that this is not just sort of the usual kind of tomfoolery, but rather that there's now kind of a bigger globalist agenda attached to this too. And one of the ways I know that to be true is because our prime minister, the kind of Instagram influencer prime minister, which is pretty much all he does is have his picture taken, was in Ukraine being photo opped, right? And we, Canada, we stayed out of Iraq. Like we were smart, and the Canadian public was having none of it. You could not have gotten the citizenry here behind the Iraq war. And yet he's over there doing his thing with Zelensky. I don't know, do you get social credit points or something for posing with him if you're a world leader? But I'm just wondering if, especially based on what you wrote about this, if you feel that this kind of broader globalist agenda about making everything more kind of homogeneous is also perhaps driving a bit of what's happening in Ukraine.
I don't think there's any question of that. And globalism is bound up with our dominance of the financial system. I'm sure you're familiar with Michael Hudson and his work on our control and use of the international finance system to effectively bully nations into growing the crops we want them to grow and doing the things in policy terms that we want them to do. So that's part of it. And Putin gave a speech 2-3 years ago in which he said that he would not mortgage Russia's future to the international finance system, that he would not allow the international financial system to subjugate Russia. That's a pretty profound statement that not very many people paid a great deal of attention to at the time. And I think that is part of what's going on. And the bad news for us is that our attempts to bully Russia have compelled the Russians to become increasingly independent, autarkic, to get along without us. And we, on the other hand, are finding it very difficult to get along without them. And I'm talking about Western Europe and the United States in a whole range of areas, metals, minerals, agriculture, not just oil and natural gas. So I think that's part of it. The other thing that I think is going on is to go back to this business of posturing. I think there is something morally corrupt about asking tens of thousands of people to die in a proxy war for your interests, which is what we're doing with the Ukrainians. It's really no longer about Ukraine. If it were just about Ukraine, I think the war would have ended some time ago. Because if you're a political realist in international relations and a war breaks out in Ukraine, a region of the world where too many wars have happened and too many millions of lives have been squandered, and you realize that this is immediately on Russia's border, a sane person would have said, wait a minute, we need to arrange a ceasefire. And we would have sent the Secretary of State immediately to Moscow and said, we need a ceasefire. Put an end to this as soon as possible, convene a conference that recognizes everyone's legitimate interests and find a way out of this. There was never any interest in that. This business of neutrality for Ukraine, which I and many, many others have been discussing for a very long time, is something that was absolutely fundamentally rejected. In fact, if you go back to the late part of March, when we still had a Ukrainian negotiating team, and Zelensky acknowledged that he was prepared to accept neutrality and was open to discussions about about some sort of potential form of autonomy for the Russians in eastern Ukraine. As soon as that happened, it was shut down. He was told no. And he turned around and then became much more combative and resistant to any negotiated solution. Well, we've now succeeded in dragging this out to the point where eastern Ukraine and increasingly portions of western Ukraine are destroyed. Destroyed. Thousands of people have died. We don't know how many, but tens of thousands have died. And we've got, between 8 and 10 million refugees? And this is now becoming an enormous problem in Western Europe. No surprise, given the refugees they've already taken in, correct?
Yeah, and I think what's maybe the most disgusting part of all of this, besides the actual death of Ukrainians, is the idea that their death is being wrapped in Churchillian rhetoric by people like Boris Johnson and our Prime Minister and Biden, right? Like you can almost hear the kind of Churchill accent with them kind of saying, we'll fight to the last Ukrainian, which is the kind of a cliche about it right now. But it's awful to hear them trying to be statesmanlike while they're consigning civilians to certain death. It's just gobsmackingly ridiculous to me.
Well, what I get frequently from some of my West Point classmates is, Doug, what's wrong? What is wrong with you? Why aren't you why won't you get on board? Of course, I heard that about, our events in Afghanistan and Iraq because I always opposed any policy that resulted in an occupation. My view was you go in, you accomplish your limited objective, and you leave. Because the objective is always to do as little damage as possible, not as much as you can possibly do, and not to spend any more money than absolutely necessary. I mean, that's kind of my view in this world. If you're going to use military power at all, and said, well, don't you understand it? And of course, many of them were eager to get in line to be paid handsomely for helping these efforts, whether it involved advice or active training and equipment. And they said, well, what's wrong with Doug? He doesn't get it. Well, they're right. I don't get it. I'm not a multimillionaire. I have not enriched myself as a result of all these things. I was always very uncomfortable with it. Now with this Ukraine business, it seems to be really out of control. And I'm always astonished that almost on cue within the first few days of this intervention by the Russians in eastern Ukraine to destroy the Ukrainian forces that were poised at that point to attack, every retired general officer is universally singing the same tune, characterizing Russia as some sort of Soviet throwback and claiming that the Russians are committing all sorts of atrocities. And my own experience in the Balkans was that it's best not to say anything until you have an independent team constituted preferably by people from neutral countries. Look at the facts on the ground before you say anything, because frequently you found out that what had happened was very different from what was originally reported. And Trish, journalists do write the first chapter of any history of anything anywhere. And journalists are not terribly concerned about the accuracy of what they write because too many of them are ideologically engaged in supporting the outcome for one side or the other.